Snow covered everything like a heavy white blanket, and the wind screamed through the trees like a beast on the hunt. The forest looked dead, lifeless, frozen in time. No birds, no animals, not even the sound of cracking branches. Just cold. John Hale, a former field engineer from Earth, moved carefully through the snow, gripping his scanner tight. He had not planned to be here. His shuttle had crash-landed 3 days ago on this uncharted world. Since then, he had found no life, no sign of rescue, only this endless white silence. His gloves were torn, fingers numb, and every breath came out like steam from his mouth. He checked his scanner again, hoping for warmth, food, or shelter. But what flashed on the screen wasn't heat from a shelter or campfire. It was 2 faint life signatures. Close, fading, weak. Without hesitation, John followed the signal downhill into a grove where the snow piled thick around bent pine trees. That's where he found them. 2 figures huddled beneath a half-fallen tree, barely covered, shaking, pale green skin nearly blue from the cold. They were young, alien females, clearly sisters. One had silver-blue hair braided in long strands. The other had deep orange hair tied back with what looked like a piece of torn cloth. Their faces were bruised, their clothes torn and thin, not meant for winter survival. When John stepped closer, the younger one flinched. The older one shielded her with her arm, growling low, but too weak to fight. He raised his hands to show he meant no harm. Then he dropped his scanner, took off his coat, and knelt beside them without a word. Their eyes, large and glowing slightly in the low light, studied him as if they couldn't believe what he was doing. He wrapped his coat around both of them, then pulled out an emergency heating patch from his survival belt and pressed it between their bodies. Warmth spread slowly, and the younger girl let out a weak gasp. The older one whispered something in a language he didn't understand. John spoke softly, repeating that he wouldn't hurt them, that he just wanted to help. Their eyes never left him. He checked their bodies for wounds without touching anything inappropriate. The younger girl's leg was swollen, possibly broken. The older one had burns on her side, probably from an energy blast. Whoever attacked them had left them to die. John felt his jaw tighten. They weren't just survivors. They were targets. He didn't know why. He didn't care. What mattered now was keeping them alive. He pulled them both closer, wrapped them in thermal sheets, and used a heat flare to warm the snow-packed shelter. As the snow outside thickened, John stayed awake while they rested. The older sister woke first. Her voice was raspy, unfamiliar, but she pointed to herself and said, "Liara." Then she pointed to the younger one, "Nima." John nodded and repeated their names. "I'm John," he said, tapping his chest. Liara watched him with suspicion, then confusion, then something else. She reached out and touched his face gently, as if trying to understand what kind of creature would help them without demand or fear. Nima woke hours later, eyes wide, scared, but when she saw Liara alive and warm, and John sitting guard with a makeshift spear by the entrance, she smiled faintly. She tried to speak but coughed. John gave her water and tucked the blanket tighter around her. They were small, fragile, but clearly intelligent. Their wounds needed attention. But the worst part was how thin they were. They had not eaten in days. John took out the last of his rations and split them between the 2 girls without eating any himself. That night, inside a shelter built from snow and branches, lit only by the soft glow of a flickering emergency beacon, 3 lives rested together. John didn't know who they were or why they were out here, but the way Liara kept watching him, never speaking but always near, and the way Nima clung to his arm when she fell asleep told him something deeper than words. They had been hunted, broken, and left to die. But now, they had someone who wasn't going to leave. When the snowstorm finally passed, The pale morning light revealed the wreckage of something large scattered not far from their shelter. John saw it through the trees while gathering dry sticks. Burnt metal, scorch marks, pieces of armor. Whatever happened here had been violent and recent. The strange markings on the debris didn't look human. He recognized symbols etched into some, pieces that matched alien patterns he had seen only once on a diplomatic briefing before his mission began. Liara followed him as he moved closer to the wreck. She was still weak, but stubborn. Her steps slow, yet deliberate. She pointed at the wreckage and whispered something sharp and angry in her language. Then she lifted a broken piece of metal that bore a bloodstain. Her hands trembled as she gripped it. John looked at her face and saw pain, not just physical, but deep emotional hurt. She wasn't just a survivor of this crash. She had lost someone here. John didn't ask questions. He knelt beside her, helped her stand, and led her back to the shelter. Nima was waiting and smiled when she saw them return. The girl's energy had improved, and her eyes followed her sister's every move. The bond between them was strong. John sat beside them and opened his emergency kit. He used healing foam on Liara's burns and wrapped Nima's leg tightly to prevent further damage. Both sisters let him help without fear now. He offered them more food, just ration bars and recycled water, but to them it must have felt like a feast. Liara broke her bar in half and gave it to Nima before eating. John saw how they cared for one another, and it stirred something in him. He had been alone for so long, wandering from contract to contract, system to system. But here, in this frozen place, he felt needed again. He felt seen, and that terrified him more than the cold. Later that day, they moved slowly toward higher ground. John carried Nima on his back while Liara walked beside him. The higher elevation might give them a better view of the terrain, and maybe a signal point for his distress beacon. As they walked, Liara spoke more. Her words were slow, broken, and mixed with her own language, but John started to understand bits. She told him they were fleeing from a faction called the Izari, soldiers who had declared their family traitors. John didn't understand the politics behind it, but he didn't need to. What he understood was that someone tried to kill these girls, left them in the snow with no mercy. That was enough. As they reached the ridge, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. A shimmer of light touched the treetops, making the snow sparkle. Nima gasped softly and pointed at a distant mountain. Smoke rose from behind it, possibly another wreck or settlement. John adjusted the antenna on his wrist and activated the beacon again. The device flashed but gave no confirmation. They were still too far from any major signal path. He sighed and knelt down to let Nima rest. Liara crouched beside them and placed a hand on his shoulder. She looked into his eyes, and there was no fear this time, only trust. John realized she had made a decision. Whatever path she was on, she wanted him there too. They found a small cave under the ridge and decided to shelter there for the night. John built another fire and used branches to block the wind. Nima curled up close to him while Liara rested beside her. For the first time, the silence wasn't heavy. It felt safe. The girls were breathing evenly, not shivering anymore. He watched them sleep and promised himself something he hadn't dared before. He would not abandon them. He would see them to safety. As night fell again and stars blanketed the sky, John sat outside the cave holding a sharpened stick and staring into the dark trees. He wasn't sure what was out there, but he felt it. Movement. Eyes. He stayed still, listening. He was no soldier, but he had instincts. And something told him they would not be left alone for long. John didn't sleep that night. The wind howled through the trees, and every creak sounded like footsteps. He sat at the cave entrance with a sharpened stick in one hand and a small flare in the other. His eyes scanned the dark forest, searching for movement. Inside, the two alien sisters slept, curled close together under the thin blanket. The fire was almost out, but their soft breathing reassured him they were still alive. Near dawn, he spotted movement at the edge of the woods. Shadows slipped between trees, too silent for wild animals. He crouched low and signaled to Liara, who woke instantly. Her instincts were sharper than his. She grabbed her sister and pressed her close to the cave wall. John lit the flare and held it high, warning whatever was out there that he wasn't afraid. The orange light flickered across the snow, revealing a flash of armor in the distance. The figures didn't charge. They watched, silent, observing, then disappeared into the forest as fast as they had come. John stayed still, heart pounding, eyes burning from lack of sleep. Liara moved beside him and looked out. She whispered one word. Hunters. He didn't need translation. The Izari had found them. He turned to check on Nima. She was awake, frightened, but silent. Her eyes were wide and full of questions she didn't dare ask. They couldn't stay in the cave any longer. John packed their supplies while Liara helped Nima walk. The snow had thinned slightly, making movement easier. He led them north, keeping low and quiet. Every few minutes, he checked the forest behind them. Nothing followed, but the sense of being hunted never left him. The world around them was too quiet, too empty. Even the birds didn't return with the light. After hours of walking, they came upon a frozen stream. John cracked the surface and filled their water packs. Liara stood beside him, eyes scanning the tree line while Nima sat on a rock, shivering, despite the layered blankets. John tried to smile at her, to show things were okay, but she didn't smile back. She looked at him with sadness, as if she knew something bad was coming. That look stayed with him the rest of the day. By afternoon, they reached a small valley surrounded by broken cliffs. In the center stood a half-buried ship, old and rusted, its hull covered in snow. John approached carefully and knocked on the side. No response. The door was jammed, but Liara showed him a hidden release under the panel. It hissed open, revealing a narrow interior that smelled of metal and frost. They stepped inside and sealed the door. For the first time in days, they had walls. The ship had no power, but it was shelter. John set up a small heater and spread out their supplies. Liara explored the ship's compartments while Nima rested. She found a dusty box filled with old tools and a half-charged power cell. John used it to power a small light and charge the distress beacon. The signal was weak, but stable. Maybe, just maybe, someone would hear them. As night fell again, John prepared food and gave the sisters warm drinks. Liara sat closer to him now, not just for warmth but something else. Her eyes stayed on him, studying his face as if trying to memorize every detail. When he smiled, she smiled back. It was small, uncertain, but real. Nima leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered something in her language. Liara translated softly. She says you're not like others. You stayed. John didn't know what to say. He just nodded. He hadn't come here to be a hero. He had only wanted to survive. But now, these girls had become part of his fight. They trusted him, needed him, and he wasn't going to let anyone take them. Not the cold, not the Izari, not anyone. That night, he sharpened his tools, reinforced the door, and sat with one arm around each sister as they slept. Outside the broken ship, a single set of eyes watched from the shadows, a flash of red in the dark, a quiet hiss of static. The hunters were patient. They didn't need to rush. They were trained to wait, to stalk, and to strike when fear had softened their prey. Inside, John had no idea that the next day would test everything he had left. The morning came quiet, but tense. The air inside the wrecked ship felt colder, tighter. John stepped outside before the sisters woke up and checked for tracks. Snow had fallen lightly in the night, covering any signs of movement. But he felt something was wrong. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. the kind that whispers to your bones when you're being watched. He returned to find Liara already awake, holding a bent pipe as a makeshift weapon. She said nothing, but her eyes confirmed she felt it too. Something was close. John didn't want to scare Nima, but they couldn't stay here long. He helped them pack quickly. Liara refused to leave until John pried a loose data drive from the ship's console and handed it to her. Her fingers curled around it tightly, like it held the last piece of someone she had lost. They moved fast, staying low as they passed between broken trees and scattered rocks. The sisters didn't complain, though Nima's limp had worsened. John carried her again without hesitation. The sky above them turned gray, promising another storm. But before the first snowflake fell, John heard a sharp sound echo across the forest. A short metallic burst. It wasn't natural. It was a scanner ping. Someone was searching for them. He dropped to his knees and pulled the sisters down behind a fallen log. Seconds later, a drone passed overhead. Small, black, and silent. It hovered, scanned the area, then flew off toward the east. Liara stared after it and whispered one word. Izari. John gritted his teeth and checked the beacon. The signal was still weak but steady. He didn't know who would get it first. Rescuers or enemies. They changed direction, heading west toward a line of jagged cliffs John had seen from the ridge the day before. If they could hide among the rocks, they might lose whoever was tracking them. The climb was brutal. The cold bit deep, and snow whipped against their faces. John's fingers bled from gripping frozen stone, but he didn't stop. Lyra helped, Nima behind him, never once asking for rest. By mid-afternoon, they found a narrow crevice between two boulders that led into a hidden cave. It wasn't deep, but it was dry and shielded from above. John set up another emergency flare and gave the sisters what little food remained. Nima smiled weakly as she chewed. Liara, however, remained tense. She kept glancing toward the entrance, her hand resting on a sharp shard of metal she had turned into a blade. John sat beside her and spoke quietly. "They won't take you," he said. Liara looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes welled with tears, not from fear, from something deeper. She nodded and leaned into him. Nima crawled over and rested her head on his leg. For a few short minutes, they weren't running. They weren't hunted. They were simply together. But the moment shattered when a low beeping came from the beacon. John's heart jumped. He checked it quickly. The signal had changed. Someone had locked onto it. A response was coming. But was it human or Izari? He didn't know. Liara stared at the blinking light and whispered something soft. John didn't ask what it meant. He just tucked the device into his coat and got ready. That night, no one slept. The storm never came, but the cold returned with biting force. John stood at the cave's edge again, spear in hand, heart steady. He wasn't the same man who crash-landed here. He had something to protect now. Not just himself. He turned back to look at Liara and Nima. Their small forms wrapped in blankets, eyes shining in the dim light. They weren't just aliens. They were his family now. Far off in the forest, something moved. Slow, purposeful. A red light blinked between the trees, then vanished. John didn't wait. He stepped back into the cave and whispered one word. Move. They didn't waste a second. John lifted Nima onto his back and grabbed the rest of their gear. Liara took the lead, blade in hand, eyes scanning every corner of the night. They exited the cave quickly and slipped into the forest below the cliff line. The snow had hardened into thin ice, making every step louder than John liked. Still, they moved fast, driven by fear and instinct. The red light returned again behind them, weaving between trees like a hunter's eye. Liara saw it first and whispered something in warning. John looked back but didn't slow down. They didn't have the strength for a fight. Not yet. They had to reach higher ground, somewhere to hide or defend. John knew they were running out of places. The forest was thinning, and the cliffs ahead grew steeper with every step. They came to a frozen river, wide and glassy. John stopped. If they crossed, they'd leave tracks. If they stayed, they'd be trapped. He looked to Liara, and she gave a sharp nod. No words, just trust. John tightened his grip on Nima and stepped onto the ice. It creaked under his boots, but it held. Liara followed, one hand on his shoulder, guiding his path. They crossed together, silent as ghosts in the dark. Halfway across, a shot rang out. The ice cracked to the left, just inches from Liara's foot. John turned and saw a shadow moving among the trees. He dropped flat, shielding Nima, while Liara flung her blade with perfect aim. It missed, but it made the shooter take cover. They ran. Fast. The rest of the river passed in a blur of noise and fear. When they reached the other side, John collapsed behind a rock, breathing hard. He handed Nima to Liara and checked her leg. Still wrapped, still stable, but her skin was cold, again. He opened a heat patch and pressed it to her chest. Her small hands clung to his wrist as he worked. Liara stood watch, her blade back in her grip. The red light was gone now, but they all knew it would return. They had been marked. The Izari wouldn't stop until the sisters were captured or dead. John looked around and spotted a narrow ridge leading into a higher rock formation. It was steep, dangerous, and barely passable, but it offered cover and a better view. He pointed and Liara nodded. Together, they began the climb. John moved first, carving handholds into the ice-covered rock. Liara tied Nima to her back with strips of cloth, climbing with brutal effort. Every breath felt like fire. Every movement tested their limits. When they reached the top, the view took John's breath away. Miles of forest stretched below them, painted in silver and blue. Smoke rose far in the distance, likely where the drone had gone. But to the north, across another valley, John saw what looked like a blinking light. It was small, barely visible, but rhythmic. Not fire, not natural. A signal, maybe help, maybe death. They had no choice but to find out. John set up a temporary shelter using tarps and branches. He used his body to block the wind from the sisters. Liara finally allowed herself to rest, sitting close beside him. Nima curled up against his chest, already asleep. For a few minutes, they were still. Not safe, but not fleeing. John stared at the stars and wondered how a simple crash had turned into this fight for survival. Then he looked at the two sisters and knew the answer. They were not just passengers or refugees. They were targets because of who they were. And John wasn't just a lost human anymore. He had made a choice the moment he gave them his coat. Now, he was their shield, their sword, their last line between life and capture. He didn't know if help was coming, but he knew he would fight until his last breath if it meant giving them a chance. Far behind them, down in the trees, the Izari regrouped. The failed sniper knelt before a tall figure in heavy armor, whose voice was cold and sharp. "The human protects them," it said. "Then we kill him first." The wind howled across the ridge, carrying snow like sharp glass slicing through the air. John crouched beside the makeshift shelter and kept the fire low to avoid drawing attention. The beacon in his coat blinked slowly, pulsing like a heartbeat. It was the only sound besides the wind and the faint breathing of the two sisters huddled. Together inside the tarp-covered space, Liara barely slept. Her eyes kept drifting to John as he stood watch with frozen fingers wrapped around a broken metal rod. The way he stayed awake, unmoving, reminded her of the old guards from her home before it fell. She had trusted no one since then. But now, she found herself leaning toward him. Her trust earned not by words but by actions repeated in cold silence. John didn't let himself think about what came next. All that mattered was keeping them safe for one more night. One more stretch of hours in this frozen nightmare. He'd begun to notice patterns in the enemy's behavior. The Izari weren't rushing. They moved like wolves, tightening a circle. They wanted him to panic, but he wouldn't. If anything, he was more dangerous now than ever. At sunrise, John scouted ahead alone. He moved across a thin ledge toward a rocky point where he could watch the northern valley. There, the signal light he'd seen the day before still blinked, regular and steady. He marked the direction and returned to the shelter. When he arrived, Liara was standing with her blade drawn, tense until she saw his face. She lowered it quickly and looked away. They ate a small portion of dried rations. Nima sat in John's lap, resting her head under his chin. She had spoken more that morning, her voice returning in soft, tired words. She asked him where Earth was, what kind of home it had. John told her it had trees like this, snow like this, but also beaches and sun and firelight. She listened like someone hearing about a dream that might be real. By midday, they moved again. Nima rode on John's back while Liara walked beside him. The climb was rough, but they were close now. Just beyond a bend in the rocks, they found what John had hoped for, an old communications tower. It was half collapsed, its top twisted and broken, but the base module blinked with life. He hurried forward and opened the control panel. It responded with a soft hum. Liara watched the cliffs around them while John patched the beacon signal through the tower. The connection boosted instantly. A new signal flashed. Received. For the first time since the crash, John felt hope. Maybe help would come. Maybe someone had heard them. He turned to share the news, but his words froze in his throat. Liara wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on the path behind. 3. Izari emerged from the trees below. Black armor, red visors, energy rifles in hand. John dove behind the tower, pulling Nima with him. Liara moved like lightning, using the rocks for cover. The enemy began firing. Snow and stone exploded around them. John returned fire with a flare gun, the heat burst scattering them just long enough for Liara to strike. Her blade tore through the first one before he could raise his weapon. The second soldier fired and hit John in the arm. Pain surged down his side, but he didn't stop. He tackled the soldier and slammed him into the rock. The rifle clattered away. John grabbed a broken piece of antenna and drove it through the soldier's helmet. Sparks flew. The body dropped. He turned to see Liara struggling with the third, their blades locked. She was smaller, but her rage gave her strength. John didn't hesitate. He picked up the fallen rifle and aimed. One shot. The third soldier collapsed. The silence returned, broken only by John's ragged breathing. He dropped the weapon and staggered toward Liara. She caught him before he fell, her hands warm on his shoulders. Nima ran to him, crying out. He smiled at both of them, then looked at the tower. The beacon light was still flashing, stronger than ever. John's wound was worse than he admitted. Blood soaked through the cloth wrapped around his arm, and the cold made it hard to breathe. But he forced himself to stay upright. Liara supported him with one arm while Nima held his hand tightly. They moved back into the base of the broken tower, finding cover behind a cracked metal wall. The beacon continued to flash, a silent signal of both hope and danger. Liara used snow to slow the bleeding. Her hands moved fast, wrapping new fabric around the injury with care. She didn't speak, but her expression showed more fear than John had ever seen on her face. She wasn't afraid of the Izari. She was afraid of losing him. He touched her wrist gently and nodded. He wasn't ready to leave them yet. Not while they still needed him. Nima leaned close, whispering in her soft alien voice. She placed her tiny palm against his chest, just over his heart. Her eyes, large and glowing, searched his face as if looking for proof he would survive. John gave her the smallest smile he could manage. The pain was rising, but he refused to let it show. These girls had fought through so much. He wouldn't be the one to fall now. Suddenly, the tower's receiver emitted a loud beep. A voice crackled through the speaker in a garbled transmission. John pressed his ear close and adjusted the dial. The words came slowly into focus. It was a human voice. A rescue ship from an outpost station had received the beacon and was on its way. They would arrive in less than 2 hours. The signal repeated, clear and steady. Relief swept through John like fire. He looked at Liara and nodded again, this time with more strength. She understood. Help was coming. But then her gaze shifted, sharp and alarmed. John turned and saw shapes moving in the trees again. More Izari. At least 4 this time, and one of them wore a commander's crest. They had followed the trail of their fallen soldiers, and now closed in on the tower. John stood despite the pain. He checked the fallen rifle from earlier. It had 1 charge left. 1 shot. Liara lifted her blade. Her jaw tightened. Nima pulled back, retreating into the corner of the shelter with wide eyes. John placed the rifle in Liara's hands and picked up a broken metal rod. "They'll expect me to fight," he said. "Use that when they don't expect it." They made their stand at the edge of the tower. John stepped into view, drawing the enemies toward him. His steps were slow, his breath uneven, but his eyes were steady. The Izari commander pointed and gave the order. 2 soldiers moved in. John raised his rod and struck the first one low, knocking him off balance. The second fired. The blast grazed John's side, but he held his ground. Then Liara moved. Silent and fast, she struck from the shadows. The stolen rifle discharged once, hitting the commander directly in the chest. He dropped with a thud. The remaining soldier turned too late. Liara's blade sliced clean across his arm, forcing him to flee. The silence afterward was heavy. John dropped to one knee. His vision blurred. Liara caught him and called out his name. Nima rushed forward. Tears streaming down her face, she wrapped her arms around both of them. Trembling, John felt their warmth, their weight, their lives pressing into him. He smiled again. The pain was bad, but he was still here. He had done what he promised. They were safe, for now. The beacon above them continued to flash like a heartbeat against the frozen sky. Far above, the clouds began to split. A distant hum filled the air. A shadow moved across the snow. The rescue ship had entered the atmosphere. John looked up through heavy eyes and saw the lights approaching. Nima pointed and cried out in joy. Liara held John tighter, whispering something only he could hear. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the engines carry him into rest. The rescue ship descended through the clouds like a promise made of steel and fire. Its engines blew snow across the mountain slope as it touched down near the shattered tower. John heard voices shouting and boots crunching toward them. He tried to rise, but his legs gave out. Liara gripped him tightly, while Nima waved both arms toward the light. Help had truly arrived. 3 armored humans rushed forward with medkits and scanners. One of them knelt beside John and tapped a patch over his wound while speaking quickly into his comm. Human male, severe blood loss, hypothermia signs, but alive. The words blurred in John's ears, but he caught enough to know they were safe. The other 2 officers turned to Liara and Nima and paused, clearly surprised. The sisters stood close to John, not stepping away. Their eyes burned with warning, as if daring anyone to touch him without care. The officer adjusted his tone and spoke slowly. "We're here to help. You're safe now." Liara lowered her blade, and Nima nodded carefully. The medics helped John onto a stretcher, and for the first time, his body relaxed into the warmth of real medical aid. Inside the ship, the air was warm and dry. John drifted between sleep and waking as machines healed and stabilized him. Through the haze, he felt Nima's hand in his and Liara's silent presence beside him. Days passed in recovery. When he finally stood without pain, he found them waiting outside the medbay, both wearing clean clothes and soft expressions. They hadn't left him once. The outpost commander met with John privately. A tall woman with sharp eyes and tired shoulders. "You did more than survive," she said. "Those girls were being hunted. The Izari wanted them dead because of their bloodline. Royal descent. They were heirs to a throne that no longer exists." John listened in silence. Then he asked the only thing that mattered. "What happens to them now?" The commander hesitated before answering. "That depends. The Galactic Treaty doesn't protect orphaned royalty from dissolved systems. But your report changed things. You claim them under human emergency protection. Technically, they're now wards of Earth." John exhaled slowly. That meant safety. That meant no more running, but it also meant responsibility. The commander smiled. "They requested something else too." Liara stepped into the room as if summoned by the very mention of her name. She walked straight to John and placed her hand gently on his chest. "We stay with you," she said in clear, careful English. "Not because we owe you, because we choose you." Behind her, Nima peeked in and nodded eagerly. John didn't know what to say. His throat tightened. His answer came not from words, but from how tightly he pulled them both into his arms. Months passed on the outpost, and the snow became a distant memory. John worked as an engineer again, but this time he didn't live alone. Liara trained in security operations. Nima joined school classes and loved telling wild stories about their survival. The sisters adapted fast, but they never strayed far from him. Wherever he was, they followed. Not from fear, from choice. One evening, as the sun set behind the silver towers of the colony, John sat on a bench with both sisters beside him. Liara leaned into his shoulder, calm and confident. Nima rested her head in his lap, humming a tune she had learned. The stars began to appear, one by one. John looked at them, remembering the frozen mountain, the shattered tower, and the day he had almost died. Then he looked at the girls and smiled. He hadn't just saved them. They had saved him too. From loneliness, from drifting without purpose, from becoming a ghost of his former self. In their eyes, he found meaning again. Not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as something stronger. As family. And when strangers passed by and whispered about the strange bond between the human and the two alien girls, he didn't care. He had already made his choice. He would never leave them. He would never let them be alone again.